Hi, I want to welcome you to the market research part of the video training component of Seaport T2+2. In these sessions, we're going to be looking at how we do market research. I'm not going to repeat the material in Commercialization 101. You can read it there. It's coherent and a much more extensive presentation. What I can do in these videos for you is give you some of my tricks of the trade, some tips on how to approach it, some ideas that you can use to make it easier to do market research. So let's get started. The first idea I want to give you is that market research is really about telling a story. It's not just about the facts and the figures. Certainly they're important. Certainly you want to tell the truth. But equally important is to tell a story that's persuasive, that you believe indicates how this technology can get to the market. In order to do that, you have to think of it almost like a novel. There's a protagonist. The protagonist is the technology. There's a plot line. The plot line is the technology as it tries to find a competitive opening, deals with the competition, tries to find where its competitive advantage lies, overcomes obstacles like barriers to entry and so on, and finally finds a home with the target. Then there's characters in the novel. In addition to just the technologies, there's the developers, the stakeholders, the end users, the targets, competitors, so on and so forth. And you weave this story together. It's almost like Jason and the Argonauts or some mythic tale where the hero has to overcome all these big hurdles in order to get to market. And when you get done, it seems inevitable that the technology should be going to market. That's the kind of story you want to tell. A story that makes it seem that, of course, this technology should go to market, and one reason it seems that way is the data supports it. Now, another way to look at this storytelling is from a scientific perspective. What are we doing? The story is really like a hypothesis, and we are going to falsify or sustain that hypothesis by finding data that indicates what's going on. The data is like little stepping stones that pin the assumptions we have to make as we go along this path across the fjord in order to get to the market. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be figuring out how do we tell this story, how do we tell it persuasively, and we'll start looking at some of the components of that in the next session. Well, let's get started. Now, to move the technology to market, there needs to be a buyer. The buyer is going to buy for an end user or is the end user. The easiest way to get a handle on who the buyers or more importantly, who the end users are is to find a resource like the Occupational Outlook on the Department of Labor's site of the U.S. government, or an equivalent if you're in a different country, or if it's a disease, something like the Centers for Disease Control website where they talk about what happens to patients and people who have diseases. You're trying to find some authoritative source that gives you sort of an understanding of the skills, the experiences, what's going on in the life of the person who is that end user and is going to stimulate the buying behavior. That's the trick for getting into that person's shoes and walking in their shoes. You need to find something that gives you an idea of the world they live in, and then you have to try and empathize and put yourself in that world. The easiest way to do that, quite frankly, is to pick up the phone and call them, as I've said before, to walk out and go to their place of work and talk to them directly. The other aspect in trying to empathize with somebody who's an end user is to try to imagine yourself doing that job. Once you read about it, you say, well, what would it be like if I only had that education? What would, in that skill mix? Or, wow, I had all those skills in education. What would it be like for me? What would my life be like? What would it be, would I, when I come home, would I be satisfied? Would I be grouchy? When I'm in the work, would I be like sweating and trying to get the dirt out of my eyes? Or am I in a clean office? Or am I out there and people are shooting at me? Who knows what? But you're trying to understand sort of the nitty-gritty of their life, because the story can't be abstract. It has to be about these people, because the buyers and the sellers are not institutions. People who buy are real people, just like you and me. Similarly, our competition and ourselves as sellers are real people. And we have to try and get a handle on who these individuals are as people, as well as members of something called a customer segment, which is simply a group of people who have similar traits and buy the same kinds of things using the same kind of criteria. Or on the standpoint of sellers, in what they call an industrial sector, which is all the companies in the sector that sort of compete the same way and are selling toward the same kind of stuff for the same people. Those are abstractions. The story has to be concrete. So as you're telling the story, even if you're using data about large social trends, you always have to try to understand what it means for the buyer as a person, for the seller as a person. How do you make this story concrete so that it's about real people? Because if it's not about real people, there's no way anybody's going to find it persuasive, because only real people buy things. Now, these real people live in a context. Right now, I'm sitting in the basement of my house. I look out the window. I could turn the camera, but I'm not going to get up to bother to do it right now. And there's snow out there. So it's cold, so I've got a sweater on. That's the context. Market orientation isn't only about trying to understand the end user. It's also about trying to understand the context they're in. Because the context sets constraints on what that end user is likely to do and likely to buy. If I am buying stuff to use at home, I may approach it differently and have different price thresholds than if I was buying it to use at work, where I may not even be allowed to buy anything. I may have to go and get approval from somebody to buy. So these contexts very much shape what people are looking for out of technology. Typically, when we look at the context, we'll see that there's a couple of things that are very important. When you get in your car, what's really important? It's safe. It doesn't cost you a fortune to run, which is why fuel efficiency has become so important. It starts reliably. And after that, we're into the stuff like I may want a great sound system, or gee, I have a bad back, I want a nice seat. Typically, people can only keep 3 or 4 things in their mind as buying criteria, major buying criteria anyways, at any one time. So we want to try and figure out what those 3, 4, 5 major things are. And the way we do this, we look at the context in light of who the end user is, and that interaction helps constrain what's going on so that we can begin to eliminate things and thus winnow down towards what might be the viable candidates for what's the important criteria for buying. That's the trick to figuring out where we're going to go to select an application to move this technology to market. Let's take an example. I have a piece of sapphire. I can use it to make watch crystals, or I can use it to make the windows on solar collectors. Sapphire is very hard, can take a lot of heat. If I'm making watch crystals, if the sapphire is expensive, it doesn't make sense, because I'm selling these watches, unless I'm doing very high-end watches, I'm selling these watches for $5, $10. On the other hand, the cost of the solar collector is substantially higher because it's part of a piece of machinery. It's generating revenue by collecting energy and putting energy back out, so I can offset the cost of it. And in that context, I can pay more. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about trying to empathize with the end user and understand the context of what's going on and how they begin to think about, see, when I'm looking at that crystal, I'm thinking, gee, what's the trade-off for me between scratch and robustness? And that has to do with how expensive and how valuable that watch is, how much utility I get from it. On the other hand, in the solar collector, not only am I thinking value, robustness, all those kinds of things, but I'm also thinking, well, gee, if it lasts longer, I can recoup the price because I'll make more electricity and I can sell the electricity. Okay, enough on market orientation. Read up on it, you'll get a much better understanding of it. And let's go to the next topic in the next session, which is why do we even care about technology?